the capstone of this was the Belt and Road Initiative, of course. And Chinese companies been building railways, ports, roads, energy facilities, and these projects that were implemented mainly under the Belt and Road Initiative banner that become in Africa. But after 2 decades of growing sway, China has taken a new approach, and now Beijing is mainly bringing an end to the era of high risk and high cost mega infrastructure projects. And in favor, I would say, often in favor of smaller frontier investments in cloud computing, 5G technologies, artificial intelligence, and the like. Okay. On the other hand, on the diplomatic front, at the latest forum on China-Africa cooperation, POCA, you remember we have mentioned it, President Xi Jinping proposed elevating the African continent's relationship with China to the level of strategic partnership. And some observers have pointed out that this continental level upgrade demonstrates China's ambition to foster coalitions across the so-called global south, in the context of competition with the United States, with Beijing adapting its official rhetoric to give voice to an alternative to the Western-led global order. So we can say that China's diplomatic framework is also evolving rapidly. So to better understand the direction in which Chile's presence in Africa is changing, today we have invited Professor Pádraig, Carmody, who will give a lecture entitled Post-Peak China in Africa, Insights from Zambia. And just very briefly, Professor Carmody is professor in geography at the Trinity College, University of Dublin, where he did his undergraduate and master work. At Trinity College, he directs the Masters in Development Practice. He's also a senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg. His PhD is from the University of Minnesota in the US, where after graduation, he also taught at the University of Vermont. His research centers on the political economy of globalization in Africa, and he has published in journals as the European Journal of Development Research, Review of African Political Economy, Economic Geography, and World Development. So thank you, Pádraig, for accepting our invitation, and we're looking forward to hearing your analysis on how and why the political economy of globalization in Africa is changing in relation, and specifically, I mean, in a specific country, is changing in relation to China these days. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much to Professor Janella for the invitation. I hope people can hear me online. If not, just let me know and I'll switch on the microphone. But as the professor was saying, I want to talk to you today about what she was mentioning there, about the reconfiguration of Chinese strategies in Africa using Zambia as a case study. And you see it has a question mark there, post-peak China in Africa. So are we entering a new era of Afro-Chinese relations, or is there continuity, or what's going on? This isn't working.
It's working now?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay, so you're probably all familiar as the professor noted, with the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a quote from the Chinese President Xi Jinping, talking about contributing to global development, welcoming the rest of the world on board the express train of Chinese development. So access to Chinese technology, finance, infrastructure development, moving forward at a fast pace or rate, maybe like China itself. That's what that quote is trying to kind of encapsulate or to convey. Again, you may be familiar with this signature foreign policy initiative, initially called the One Road and One Belt Initiative, then rebranded as the Belt and Road Initiative, focused largely on Eurasia, but also incorporating Africa. Some people see this as a kind of geostrategic move that, as the United States under President Obama made an explicit pivot to Asia and away from Europe and West Asia, that the Chinese were reorienting towards Europe and towards West Asia and to Africa by way of kind of balancing that pivot to Asia by the United States. But fundamentally, the Belt and Road Initiative is an economic program. Maybe to call it a program is to overstate it. Some people have said it's actually a discursive framework. It's not a defined set of projects and kind of investment opportunities. It's actually a way of talking about China's foreign policy more broadly and creating this discursive envelope which kind of captures that. So after the what the Chinese call the North Atlantic financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the Chinese economy was badly affected. And what did they do? They stimulated the economy massively, okay? But that resulted in massive overcapacity, for too much cement being produced, too much steel, too much aluminium, okay? And they had to find a new market for that. From 2010 to 2013, China produced more cement than was poured in the United States in the entire 20th century. So in the previous 100 years, the US had only produced or used as much cement as China produced in that 4-year period. Okay? So they had to find overseas markets to absorb this massive overcapacity. And the Belt and Road Initiative was part of that solution. Now, according to pronouncements by the Chinese government, there is no official map of the Belt and Road Initiative. But I was teaching a class back in Dublin last year, and one of my Chinese students said to me, "You're wrong, you know, there is a map. This is it." He said, "It was only accessible in the Chinese intranet, so not accessible through Google to people overseas, but only to Chinese citizens internally in China." There's another map he gave me as well, okay? So the Chinese government produces different maps and allows access to different information for different audiences. Okay? And this is part of what I call China's grand strategic relational approach to foreign policy. That is that, unlike the United States or maybe Germany, there aren't necessarily kind of blueprints or plans that are announced and adhered to quite strictly. Rather, the Chinese government's approach is to have this kind of reflexive, adaptive, recursive, relational approach to foreign policy, where it negotiates with actors, and in response to pushback or to agreement or alliance, then it moderates, modulates, or reconfigures its foreign policy approach. Okay? So it's not, in contrast to the idea that China is a very kind of top-down, which it is in some ways, state, it does have this kind of flexible approach which negotiates, which allows for negotiation with other actors. This is us in Ethiopia at the Eastern Special Economic Zone outside of Addis Ababa. There are Chinese built and some funded zones like this across much of the continent now. Okay? This is on a massive scale. Some people talk about China's presence in Africa being a new form of colonialism. The British or the French or the Italians maybe, when they went to the continent, didn't build industrial zones. Okay? They were more focused on raw material. Actually, the Italians were a little bit different. I would say that. So the regime here prior to World War II had a high modernist vision of industrialization for Africa, unlike the British and the French. But in general, the Europeans were interested in raw material extraction and creating markets for manufactured goods. Okay, and suppressing domestic manufacturing. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Belt and Road Initiative. I won't read out this whole quote from Flint and Dew, but basically what it's saying is that even if this program is fundamentally economically driven, it has political impacts across scales. And so you can't separate out geopolitics and geoeconomics. The two are intertwined. And these logics kind of interpenetrate and mutually infuse and inform each other. And what that does is it makes Chinese projects which take place under the auspices of the BRI sensitive to public opinion because they are both political and economic, okay? Particularly in the context of the COVID contraction. So as many African economies struggled under COVID, as debts increased, as governments tried to pay social welfare payments, tried to keep economic activity going, the issue of debt in particular attached to many of these projects came to the fore. And the Belt and Road Initiative has its own contradictions, in particular in relation to debt. Okay, so many of these projects are debt funded. Is debt a good idea for economic development? How many people think debt is a good idea? No, you're kind of some yes. Some people are saying yes, no. I suppose the answer is it depends. Okay, if you take on debt and the rate of profit that you achieve from that investment is higher than the interest payment, then you're able to pay the debt and you're getting a net economic benefit from it. If it's lower than that, then that's not the case. Okay? So it depends on the productivity of the investments. But some of these investments have underperformed. In particular, if you look at the standard gauge railway in Kenya, for example, that railway cost 6% of Kenya's GDP to build, 6% of the economy. For every 8 tons of imports being railed into Kenya, 1 ton is railed out. They're generally high value added manufactured products coming in and low value added primary materials going out, replicating a neo-colonial pattern of trade. Okay? And that, of course, creates the problem of debt to build the railway, but also, of course, if you're paying more, if you're exporting less than you're importing, you're going to build up debt to finance that as well, in the absence of other sources of finance. Okay? So huge controversies. The Kenyan government had to introduce a tax on all imports coming into Kenya to pay for the railway. Okay? So really substantial macroeconomic impacts from some of these projects. Okay, so in the context of pushback on some of these projects, their underperformance, internal developments in China that I'll talk a little bit about, there has been a process of external and internal reform in the context of these contradictions, the trade war with the US and to a lesser extent Europe. And the Chinese government has introduced new policies like dual circulation. What's this? Have you heard, anybody heard of this term before? So this was introduced in 2020, and it's the idea that China has to de-risk from the US and from Europe. We hear about that in the European Union context. But rather than being too dependent on exports to those regions, they need to build up their own internal circulation, build up the consumption power of the domestic Chinese economy, build up research and development capacity in order to insulate themselves, right, from potential trade shocks arising from geopolitical tensions, while still exporting. And some people talk about the idea of asymmetric decoupling. That is, reducing China's dependence on outside sources of growth while increasing other countries' dependence on Chinese technology, finance, and trade. Okay? Asymmetric decoupling. To stimulate the internal market in China, another signature initiative is something called Common Prosperity. which is the idea that China has become too unequal. You need to redistribute wealth to build up the purchasing power of the lower classes in China. There's a common prosperity zone in the east of the country. And I've talked about asymmetric decoupling. So you see the kind of direction of travel in terms of this grand strategic relational approach, both domestically and internationally. And all of this is taking place in the context of what some people refer to as globalization, right? So it was thought for a long time that the increased interconnectedness between economies around the world was a kind of unilinear trend. But what we've seen is it's a dialectical phenomenon. It's subject to advance and then to retreat. It's not one direction of travel. Okay? It creates its own contradictions, which reduce the rate of globalization. Or during COVID, there was actually de-globalization as trade and investment levels fell around the world. So this is a graph showing trade openness, imports plus exports as a proportion of the global economy here. And you can see it falling there even before the COVID pandemic hit. Okay? We can think about Donald Trump's protectionist agenda. We can think about those kinds of things and how they may play into de-globalization or globalization. If you look at the proportion of manufacturing as a percentage of gross domestic product in China, manufacturing value added is actually falling. So even though China is still the workshop of the world, the Chinese president says he doesn't just want it to be the workshop of the world, he wants it to be the laboratory of the world as well. He wants it to be the marketplace of the world. So the idea that China needs to upgrade away from basic manufacturing, textile and clothing and electronic assembly into the high value added sectors of the fourth industrial revolution, like artificial intelligence, biomedics, financial technology, fintech, and those kinds of things. So you see this reduction here as some other countries like Vietnam are increasing the proportion of their economy accounted for by manufacturing. Now, China, as you all know, is undergoing an economic slowdown for both internal and external reasons. Okay? And these two things come together, reinforce each other. So whereas economic growth in the early 1980s was over 15% a year, economists have something called the rule of 70, 72. What's that? You divide the rate of economic growth into 70, that will give you the doubling time of the economy. So if China was growing at 10% a year for 40 years, which it was, divide that 10 into 7, you get a doubling time of 7 years. So the Chinese economy was doubling in size every 7 years. As recently as 2005, it overtook Germany as a bigger economy. 2005 it was the UK, 2006 it was Germany. Not that long ago. Okay, but now rates of economic growth have fallen dramatically. The Chinese government says that it's about between 4 and 5%. The Rhodium Group estimates the real rate of economic growth is about 1.5%. Chinese government doesn't want to say that for fear of creating social and potentially political instability. Okay. So these kinds of statistics have fed into a narrative in the Western media about what's called peak China. This is the Economist's cover from last year, right? The idea there was this kind of exponential increase in the Chinese economy. Now it's kind of leveled out. Okay. However, China still has, as you can see, many countries signed up to this Belt and Road Initiative. I don't know if you saw that the Chinese president was in Peru this past week, opening a multi-billion-dollar port. Some people say that this is part of an approach to reroute trade away from North America, reroute South and Latin American trade away from the US and North America directly to China, creating these new kinds of networks. So there's speculation China has peaked. There was the whole COVID, excessive maybe COVID lockdowns in China. Chris Patten, the last British governor of Hong Kong, actually, I think, coined this phrase post-peak China, This is something the Western media celebrated, picked up on, we're beating China. It's not going to take over the world as we had previously thought. The economically active population of China is projected to shrink by nearly 200 million by 2050. China's population fell for the first time since the 1960s last year, and India is now the most populous country in the world, not China. Also, India is now driving the global oil market. Growth in the demand for oil is higher in India than it is in China, even though the economy is only 1/6 the size of the Chinese economy. This tells you something is shifting there again. The fertility rate in China is only 1. Generally, you need a fertility rate of 2.1 just to replace your population. So if there's only 1 child being born for every 2 people, your population is going to shrink quickly. China's facing what some people refer to as a middle income trap. The idea that, setting up a clothing factory is not that hard. You get some sewing machines, you train a few workers, the technical capabilities are not that difficult. Producing an Airbus or a Boeing jet airliner with hundreds of thousands of components, is a much more difficult proposition. And so to break out from low value added manufacturing into high-end manufacturing or high-end services is much more difficult. Now, China's leading in some sectors and running close to the US in things like artificial intelligence, robotics, and a variety of other things, okay? But nonetheless, there may be this middle income trap coming into play. Youth unemployment is thought to be at over 20% in China. What happened when this came out last year? 21% youth unemployment. The Chinese government cancelled the statistical series and recalculated, and it came out at 14%. Okay, the Chinese government has cancelled dozens and dozens of statistical series that haven't been showing the right statistics over the last couple of years, right in inverted commas. But without saying how the methodology works. Okay, so it's meant to be 14%. Many people think it's much higher. All of this means some people say China will never overtake the US, or maybe not until 2060. The US economy seems to be growing more quickly. And yet, President Xi still talks about China winning the initiative and having the dominant position. Okay? Now, this translation is disputed. Some people say that this is an inaccurate translation, but it was nonetheless, it was reported. Okay? But nonetheless, China has a very strategic approach to increasing its political and economic power, even as its economy suffers from these internal contradictions, and the Belt and Road Initiative has these problems that we've been talking about. How does this manifest specifically in Africa? This is a graph from a paper we did a couple of years ago showing new Chinese loans to Africa. So look, 28 billion in 2016, falling down to about 2.5 billion by 2020. So this is pre-COVID. COVID obviously feeds into it, but it was again what Professor Cagno was talking about, right? Or Antonella, I'm just going to call you. That there is this reconfiguration of the Belt and Road Initiative towards digital, smaller, greener projects, right, away to some extent from these large-scale, risky mega infrastructure projects. But when we look at this relational approach, what do the new strategies look like? So even as Beijing's public approval rating in the developing world plunged from 56% in pre-COVID to 40% in 2021, it has proven capable of winning and retaining foreign policy support of governing elites. Why is that? Why, as people have become more skeptical of the debt and the problems of some of these projects, has China nonetheless been able to retain the support oftentimes of political elites? Well, maybe it's not that surprising because, for example, a 10% shift in voting alignment at the United Nations General Assembly towards China results in a 276% increase in aid and loans from that country, okay? According to one study. So maybe you get rewarded by showing geopolitical alignment or allegiance to China. Lina Ben Abdallah at Wake Forest University in the US refers to this new approach as elite capture strategies. Rather than having a kind of full spectrum approach where you try and bring publics on board through building stadia, hospitals, parliamentary buildings, presidential palaces for the elites, obviously, but nonetheless, or giving the African Union a new headquarters, which cost about $200 million to build as a gift. Okay? Now, it was reported after that was built that the servers in the African Union headquarters were downloading data every night and transmitting it back to China. So there was a whole scandal around that. Okay. In another paper, we still talk about the ways in what kind of advantages China brings to its competition with the Western powers. And we developed this through the idea of what we call web power. What's this? In China, there's more than 100,000 state-owned enterprises at both national and provincial level. And the Chinese government and the provincial governments control promotions in those enterprises. Okay? They may not directly control them. They compete vigorously on a commercial basis. But nonetheless, the Chinese government is able to structure incentives through tax breaks, loans, promotions, and other mechanisms, right, to give a direction of travel to many of these companies. If you're a private sector employer in China, if you have more than, I think it's 50 employees, you have to have a Communist Party cell in your company. Okay? There has been a crackdown on entrepreneurs who were felt to be too independent in China. I don't know, you've probably heard of Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, who disappeared. He disappeared a few years ago. One of the richest people in the world, head of one of the most successful businesses, just disappeared. And when he reappeared, it was at an event to celebrate rural teachers in China. His sin was he had criticized the financial regulator in China. He had to leave China for a time, become a visiting professor at the University of Tokyo. Now he's back. They brought him back on board. But nonetheless, you get the kind of idea. Okay. So I've mentioned this kind of recursive adaptive approach, but what is web power? It's the idea that power is both concentrated and diffuse. So you have these nodes, state-owned enterprises, notionally private companies like Huawei, one of the world's biggest telecommunications companies. It's notionally a private company, but who owns most of the shares in Huawei? It's a Communist Party controlled or affiliated trade union. Okay? So the Chinese state infuses these networks through state-owned enterprises and private companies in order to achieve strategic ends. Some people talk about this as a fusion of kind of capitalism, the free market approach, and socialism, central planning. Okay? So you can see that kind of structure of power reflected in this web power. Okay, talk a little bit specifically about Southern Africa and then Zambia. So this is Southern Africa, the general area of the Southern African Development Community. Okay, talk a little bit about this. The Southern African Development Community region ran a trade surplus in 2014 of almost $10 billion with China. Okay. Sounds good? Making SADC. It's the Southern African Development Community. So it's a regional, something like the European Union, but it's focused on trade and development. Okay, there is a court and so on, but it's a regional integration mechanism. Most of that was to do with exports of Angolan oil to China. And back in the 2000s and early 2010s, Angola was China's single biggest supplier of oil. Right? Africa used to supply about 30% of Chinese, or a little bit more, Chinese oil imports. Now it's down to 10%. The Chinese have diversified their oil supplies. They don't want to be over-dependent on one region. So they've diversified towards West Asia, or the Middle East, if you want to call it that. When trade in 2014 with Angola was excluded, the balance of trade favored China almost 2-1. Okay, so if you take out fossil fuel exports from Angola, China was exporting twice as much to this region as it was importing from. Depending on which country you're talking about and when you're talking about it, some countries run substantial trade deficits at times with China, but this is heavily dependent on the price for raw materials, right? 2014, there was a global commodity price crash. This changed the dynamics. Okay. But in general, we can say that China is extractive of regional resources, importing raw materials primarily, and exporting manufactured goods. Okay. When the oil price collapsed in 2014, trade with Angola went down. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese migrants left Angola. The construction projects dried up, or it's estimated hundreds of thousands. I've talked about some of these things already, but one of the things the Western powers, in particular the United States, has done with the BRI is to weaponize it. And through the meme of so-called debt trap diplomacy. Has anybody heard of this before? Debt trap? Yes, some people have. What's this? It's the idea that China is trying to entrap countries in debt, and once it has them sufficiently indebted, that they lose their sovereignty. They have to give away ports, airports, television stations, electricity networks. And you see some evidence of these things happening in Laos, for example, the electricity network and so on. But generally, it's been debunked. We can talk more about that in the questions and answers. But it has been very successful at reducing China's popularity in the developing world, right? Because it hits a chord or it strikes a chord. If we're thinking about Zambia, Zambia is iconic in its relations with China in the region, because it was one of the first countries to recognize China upon its readmission into the United Nations in the 1970s. There's a much touted all-weather friendship. Every Zambian president says it, all-weather friendship. It doesn't matter if there's a change of government, it doesn't matter if there's trade tensions with the West, that relationship remains solid. Okay? It was the site of China's first overseas mine in Africa, and the first overseas bank branch in Africa, both in the 1990s. There are about 600 Chinese companies active in Zambia, with about US $4 billion invested, and about 60,000 people employed. So then, according to some authors, consequently, socio-political developments in Zambia can be seen as a kind of litmus test for other African states, given the longevity, the depth, and the intensity of this relationship. Now, Zambia is a landlocked country. The geography of Africa's borders, I'm sure you're familiar with, drawn on many of them, a third of them, lines of latitude and longitude, as they were carved up by the European powers. Okay? So landlockedness is the creation of colonialism. India isn't landlocked because it was colonized in a different way. And landlockedness is meant to be a developmental disadvantage because it's meant to make it more expensive to go through different customs points, pay the taxes, you're further from the sea, whatever, transport costs and so on. But China's relations with Zambia have been relatively advantageous, and those good geopolitical relations have facilitated the high level of investment coming from China. And Zambia's centrality in the region can be reconceptualized as land-linked. Okay? Access to the South African, Namibian, Zimbabwean, and other markets, right, is easier because of its centrality. So it depends. Geography is socially, or a lot of geography is socially constructed. This is the new Zambian president elected in 2021, undertaking a state visit to China last year, President Hichilema. If you look at military loans and defense spending by China over that 20-year or so period, on the continent. It amounted to about US 3 billion. How much of that did Zambia get? Got 1.5 billion, even though it's not a country that was at war. It's not a post-conflict country. So again, it shows its kind of geopolitical centrality in terms of China's strategy. Zambia is what economists call a mono-economy. 75% of exports copper and the associated mineral cobalt necessary for electric batteries for cars, EVs, electric vehicles. China takes about half of Zambia's exports. About 14% of imports come from China, and South Africa takes 57% of Zambia's, 57% of imports into Zambia come from South Africa. And Chinese and South African firms dominate different regions in the country. This tendency towards dependence on primary commodity exports has been exacerbated in the last couple of decades, partly because of the deindustrializing effects of World Bank, International Monetary Fund structural adjustment programs. Look at this statistic by way of example. 2014, Zambian production of textiles, clothing, and leather was 2.9% what it was in 1985. Think about that. Where are the textiles and clothing coming from? They're coming from China, they're coming from Vietnam. Peter Kragelund, now at the Danish International Institute for International Studies, talks about how the Western powers opening up African economies left the playing field open for China because the Western economies weren't producing the kind of cheap manufactures that China did and were in demand in African countries. Okay, just a couple of other photos showing again the kind of extractivism, the railway, again, very kind of reminiscent of colonial style, exporting raw materials, importing the railways, importing manufactured goods. In 2006, there was a presidential election in Zambia, where one of the candidates, Michael Sata, said about Chinese business people in the country, we need investors, not infestors. Okay, so an explicitly racist, populist kind of approach, unfortunately becoming more common globally. There was an explosion at a Chinese-owned dynamite factory which killed 50 people in 2005. And in 2006, Sata whipped up this kind of anti-Chinese xenophobic sentiment, which resulted in riots in the Copperbelt and in the capital city, Lusaka, against Chinese businesses, nationals. Okay, this is a photo of myself and Godfrey Handway, who is a co-author on this paper at the Zambia-China Economic and Trade Cooperation Zone, where that dynamite factory was. There's also a $250 million Chinese-funded copper smelter in this zone. Okay, so again, heavy emphasis on kind of copper export. These were the latest statistics I could get on trade between China and Zambia. And as I mentioned, depending on how cheap or expensive copper is, these trade statistics will vary substantially. So in 2022, China exported $1.4 billion to Zambia. Zambia exported $2.6 billion worth of goods and services to China. But look at what the vast majority of this was. Raw copper, not processed copper. It was being processed in China. The value added is being captured in China and other places, right? And Zambia in recent years has been the world's largest exporter of raw copper, okay, overtaking Chile, for example. Okay, this is a graph showing you the copper price. So you can see here, 2016, copper was at $4,500 a ton, rising up to over $10,000 a ton there more recently. You can see this huge volatility. This is one of the problems of having a mono economy, that your economy is heavily dependent on trends and demand in the international economy, rather than having its own internally driven dynamic, if you will. In Zambia, there has been a discourse around the neo-colonization of the country by China. Some people talk about Chambia, the idea that the country has been overtaken economically, overrun economically, political influence by China. See the Chinese Chamber of Commerce there. When Michael Sato, this guy who said we need investors, not investors, when he came to power in 2011, who was the first? So he ran on an anti-Chinese platform. Who was his first visitor to State House when he became president? Chinese ambassador. Now, there are different theories on why that happened. Some people told me that the Chinese Communist Party had started funding his party when they could see he was going to win. Secondly, China is Zambia's biggest export market, and you can't afford to alienate your biggest investor and export market. Okay? So for structural and maybe for instrumental reasons, this came about. And so the Patriotic Front government, which came into power for 10 years, developed a close, very close working relationship with China. A lot of debt was taken on. You can see this quote here, and splurged on roads, salaries, fleet of expensive fire trucks. 40% of Zambia's debt is owed to China. And according to Gort and Brooks here, in many cases, the revenues generated from primary commodity exports like copper service the debts that enable their extraction. So you can think about Chinese loans, the interest being paid on them, that's a win for the Chinese economy. Getting access to raw materials necessary to power construction and manufacturing in China, making money off that, and also then selling the manufactured goods. So this is what we can think of as a kind of closed circuit accumulation. Sometimes the loans that Chinese policy banks give out to countries like Zambia are never received in Zambia. They're held in China, and they're used to employ Chinese companies to build the railroads and the ports. So the money doesn't actually enter oftentimes the Zambian or Ethiopian economy. Again, the benefits of that are retained internally. Okay, this is a graph showing annual inflows of foreign direct investment from China into Zambia. And again, you can see this dramatic contraction as the Chinese economy slowed. And COVID took hold and a variety of other factors, okay? You can see again this dramatic kind of reduction. So are we in an era of post-peak China in Africa? Again, your professor was mentioning about FOCAC, which was held in Beijing a couple of weeks ago. The Chinese government is sensitive to a narrative that China is reining in its economic interactions with the continent. And so it announced $50 billion of new aid, investment, and loans in FOCAC a couple of weeks ago, right, to kind of offset that kind of, I think, to offset partly that narrative. No new loans were taken out. No new loans from China were taken out in 2021, and only two small ones in 2020, totaling less than 100 million. This was the new conference center, which was built with Chinese funding in Lusaka pre-COVID, or the loan was negotiated pre-COVID. The Patriotic Front government lost power in 2021 to a more Western-oriented government, okay? And according to the former governing party, the new party, the United Party for Development, was trying to make Zambia an anti-China outpost, okay? But we interviewed the director of the Confucius Institute, and they said, this is just political, internal posturing. There's no kind of truth to this. They're just trying to weaponize the kind of more pro-Western discourse of the new president for their own purposes. Zambia became the first country to default on its debt during COVID, African country, in 2020. And there was a big debt renegotiation and restructuring. When that was concluded, the president finally visited China in 2023. And he said, basically, we've reset our relationship with China, explaining that he is fostering strong ties with Beijing and that Chinese companies maintain a strong presence in Zambia. Someone did an analysis, though, and they found that his references to China being an all-weather friend or a good friend of Zambia have fallen off a cliff compared to the previous government. So there is some reorientation. Trade with the US has picked up. The US ran a summit for democracy. Kamala Harris attended it in 2023, right? Kind of signifying this geopolitical reorientation. What about Chinese investments in Zambia? So we visited some factories. One of them was the Twyford tile factory here. You can see the trucks getting ready to load up the tiles to take them to South Africa and elsewhere. This factory produces 54 square kilometers of tiles a day. It's kind of hard to believe, but you get a sense of the scale of the factory. Okay. We visited another factory down the road, a couple of miles down the road, which has its own special economic zone because it's too polluting to be located near houses near where the Twyford factory is. It's a $500 billion investment, and this company produces 60,000 bags of cement a day. Okay. Again, just a mind-blowing kind of volume and scale to some of these investments. Okay. So, when we're thinking about all of this, how do we conceptualize it? If you're wondering what these are graphics generated by ChatGPT. When I put in, create a picture of what omni-alignment looks like for the world and for Zambia. Okay. Okay, so what is omni-alignment? Some people said, omni-alignment is where you're not allied with the West or aligned with the West, or you're not allied with China, but you try and negotiate between both in order to achieve economic and political advantage. You balance, you try and keep good relations with both. It's a delicate kind of balancing act. When we interviewed a journalist in Zambia last year, she said to us, the current president is not pro-West, he's pro anyone that brings benefits. Okay. And this is this quote I mentioned about presidential references to China as an important friend, though, have declined. Okay. So there's kind of strategy to this kind of discourse. And overall, we could see this as a kind of setback, maybe, for China. But it retains, because of the scale of investment and trade, it retains a lot of influence in the country. Okay. And maybe that will grow again as Donald Trump comes into power and adopts a more isolationist kind of approach in that country. So just to conclude, to some extent, maybe the debate about whether the Chinese economy and related international influence has peaked is a little bit misplaced. It's hard to come to a summit of judgment about this because power is of different types. There's economic power, there's discursive power, there's political power. And so coming to a summit of assessment, aggregating those different variables together is quite difficult. And so the different dimensions of power may strengthen in some ways and decrease in others. So I think it's too early to talk about post-peak China in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very rich and stimulating lecture.
Okay.
I personally enjoyed this very much.
Good.
I would like to see if students would like to ask some questions, or maybe if you're a little bit shy to get started, we would start Maria Sole, Costanza, Elisa, if she's with us, the founders of AISAC. And I myself have some questions, but what happened? Oh, because the slides are.
We can start. I will just adjust it and then I will follow up.
You have a question, yeah?
You mentioned that Zambia and China have friendship related for a long time, and there's the Zambia specific countries have such strong ties with China. Why Zambia?
Okay, that's a really good question. It was partly to do with the president of Zambia at the time, who was someone called Kenneth Kaunda, and he had a philosophy called humanism. And he was kind of an African socialist, although he said he didn't want to draw on kind of Western ideas like democracy, socialism. He wanted an African philosophy, political philosophy, which he felt he was more appropriate to, to the context. So he talked about African humanism. But they had a close relationship with China. And so they recognized they were kind of ideologically similar in some ways. Kenneth Kaunda negotiated with the Chinese government to build the Tanzania-Zambia railway. So in order to, Zambia used to have to export its copper through white-ruled Rhodesia and South Africa, okay, apartheid South Africa. And the Chinese agreed that they would fund this Tanzania-Zambia railroad in order to circumvent that so that they could export directly out into the Indian Ocean and not have to trade with apartheid South Africa or to have their goods transit through it. So I think that was a big part of it. The Tanzam Railroad, there's just been a new agreement around that, where I think there's several $100 million of new Chinese money coming in to rehabilitate that railroad. And it's an iconic kind of mega project on the continent. It was completed ahead of schedule. The brick factory that made the bricks to build the accommodation for the workers on that railroad is still in operation in Lusaka. We went and we interviewed them about 10 years ago. So you can see that long-lived, deeply embedded kind of relationship there. And then also that has paid dividends for Zambia in terms of investment, in terms of loans are a mixed bag, let's say. But, I talked about the military and defense investment as well there. So I think for reasons of ideology and material interest, I think those two things came together to create this kind of all-weather friendship.
In what year did that start?
So China was admitted, Corrado or Antonella may know, I think it was in 1971 China was readmitted. It was after Nixon, I think, went to China. So it's 71 or 72?
72.
72, I think it was. Or thanks for that. So that's when that started. Because, and again, the majority of African countries voted for China's readmission into, so de-recognizing the Republic of China, Taiwan, in favor of the People's Republic of China as the Chinese representative in the United Nations. Okay, yeah.
Oh, geography.
It was really interesting.
Thank you.
It was many points that captured my attention. And for you, like the previously did not really interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have like three broader like reflection, and we can just pick one, two. One like I think this is something as a geographer, like I notice like you reflect a lot on like both geography, like you talk about scale, how scalar is moving between scale. So one thing I was wondering, if geography is such a constructed and we are constructing space, how do you see that China's presence Zambia is changing the dynamics of geographical relation have been changing, in which way in terms of scale over the year. And then there was a question more practical that I was discussing with the staff this morning. We were asking how self-housing is or not is research in certain African countries at the moment.
Yeah.
So because I'm working in Egypt now, I was working in Zambia, so like it changed a lot. The way you can do research, what you can ask, and the access. So I was wondering what was your experience in Zambia during this anti-Chinese sentiment and now through this geopolitical reorientation. Then one time, you talked about the FOCA, the last one. Sometimes I'm wondering, like even for previous this one, the last one, like, in this, like, in my experience, I saw little, like, there is these announcements of new budget,
Yeah.
but then in practice, none of us has seen any of each project in practice took place in the last 6 to 7 years. So I don't know if in your experience you came across any of each public announcement that in the last week, like after COVID. I mean, like, I went around and many of these announcements didn't get reality in practice.
Okay, great questions. So I think the Chinese government is sensitive to the fact that not all of the announcements are necessarily followed through on. And obviously COVID delayed the implementation of the previous FOCAC plans and announcements. So I did notice that they have an implementation plan, which was announced at the last FOCAC again. So they're sensitive. They're always sensitive to not alienating political elites. Okay, and so that is one mechanism of accountability. How that plays out remains to be seen. The question on scale, there's a very good book that just came out called Africa's Global Infrastructure. So I was in Utrecht a few weeks ago. They had a launch for it. But what that says is Chinese development practice or Indian development practice is not a monolith. It's not something which is transmitted from China or New Delhi to African countries. It's constructed on the ground in a relational way through interactions with local actors who renegotiate the frame and terms of those engagements. So they use the term globalities rather than globalization. So the idea that you have these places which are relationally constructed rather than a kind of overweening or dominant China kind of pushing its agenda, that the relationships are refracted through pre-existing socio-spatial relations in the recipient states, if you will. So I think that's an interesting way to think about it. And what we can see, I think, is over the last couple of decades, we've seen the creation of a new trans-regionalism between China and Africa. So for the first time in hundreds of years, there has been a reorientation from the global north to what some people refer to now as the global east in terms of the focus of economic interactions. So I think you can think about this in different scalar levels or ways. So those might be two. And then your third question about gaining access is very pertinent. So I found it really difficult, or we found it very difficult to do field work last year. So we have done a few rounds of field work in Zambia, but I went to the Ministry of Finance. I had set up an interview at the Ministry of Finance. Sat down for my interview, I put on my tie, etc. And I arrived in and he said, okay, what do you want to talk about? And I said, I want to talk about Zambia's debt to China. And he just goes, too sensitive. So that was it. He said, send in a letter. And I said, but I'm leaving the day after tomorrow. He said, no, we'll process it quickly. Send in a letter and I'll put it up the chain kind of thing. I spoke with the president's economic advisor. Again, once I told her, because the debt renegotiation was happening at that time and it was very politically charged, the opposition PF party was hammering the government about all of this. So again, she said, oh yeah, very interesting, didn't want to talk to me. So we had to adopt this strategy of kind of triangulation where we talked to trade unionists, we talked to journalists, we talked to academics, we gathered reports and media reports and tried to put things together indirectly through talking to people who knew the main actors who were involved and knew the kind of dynamics and social relations and political relations that were at play. But China has undergone a process of authoritarian deepening in the last 5 years in particular. As the economy has slowed, there's kind of nearly a perfect correlation. I was reading about this the other day. There's a cycle in China called Fang Shu, which basically means the government cracks down when it thinks things are getting out of control, and then it liberalizes or opens up space for expression once it feels things have been stabilized, and then it cracks down. So there's this kind of political cycle at play in China. But if you look at what's happening there in the last couple of years, I think it's quite pronounced. You see now Chinese journals where articles that were open access are now being retracted. So they've said things that are perceived to be critical of the government, for example, and so that they're now just being taken off the web. Any book I've read published in China, any book on China not published in China is now banned in China. And apparently some libraries to comply with this have been burning books. Who was it? So, which again is a very worrying kind of phenomenon. And some people have said there's a new book out called Vampire State, The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. And in the preface to that, the author says the inspiration for the title comes from a book written about the German fascist economy in the 1930s. And he said what struck him was that you could substitute People's Republic of China for Nazi Germany, he said, in a lot of the text, and you would see similar kinds of dynamics at play. So the incentive for a Chinese diplomat, business person, official to talk to someone and say something is non-existent, whereas there are risks. So this means it's more difficult to do research. It's still possible. Some people would talk to you off the record as well. But it's become much more difficult, I would say. So it's something you have to negotiate carefully.
Other questions? Yes.
The election of Donald Trump and the president has, how is there going to be an influence on Chinese and African relations?
Yes, I think there will be, definitely. So I think, you know, I watched a talk online by Richard Wolff the other day, a famous American economist. And he said, you know, first of all, the era of kind of Western hegemony is over. Donald Trump is a reflection of that. But Donald Trump also speeded that. And he said, you know, what the US did, I don't know if I agree with it totally, he said, but the US tried to, he said, isolate the rest of the world. But what that has done is it has isolated the United States. Okay. So Donald Trump, you know, referred to African countries and Haiti as S-hole countries. So I won't, you know what that is. He said Africa was a space where his friends went to get rich. He made up a country. He got Nambia and Zambia confused. So he talked about Nambia in one of the kind of receptions with African ambassadors. So he's evinced complete disrespect to the African Union when he called African countries S-hole countries. The African Union Commission put up on their website that they were outraged by this, okay? And demanded an apology for that insult. But what Trump did was he pulled American soldiers out of Africa. He pursued a transactional, extractive approach to the continent. When Rwanda tried to build up its own textile and clothing industry by banning imports of second-hand clothing, Trump kicked them out of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So there are a few $1 million worth of second-hand clothing a year going to Rwanda from the US. Nothing. I did the statistics, like 0.0000001% of American exports. I'm making that up, but you get the idea. It was completely insignificant, but nonetheless, you know, no, America was going to make money and American companies out of this. So I think what he will do is he will alienate African political elites. He will then leave the field open for China to further exercise influence and increase its level of interactions with the continent. So in trying to make America more prominent and powerful, he will, I think, in the longer term, accomplish the obverse. He will alienate people and he will open space for rival powers to exercise greater influence on the continent.
The former China had a more influence policy in international relations. There is one outside question. Helping Zambia, you know, financially with the military, it's not a little competition. It's not a little bit of competition.
I know you can speak.
I just didn't catch the last bit. It's,
Financial,
yeah, contradiction, yes. So, you know, China's non-interference policy kind of covers a multitude. Okay. So there's a very interesting kind of dynamic between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. The Chinese Communist Party does not exist legally in China. Its offices are in a small office building near Tiananmen Square with a small nameplate. Okay? It doesn't legally exist, so it can never be taken to court, can never be held to account legally for any of its actions. Okay? You may have seen a few years ago when the head of Interpol, who was Chinese, got off the plane, he was arrested, disappeared, and then was charged with corruption. Okay? So the party state in China is able to use this kind of legal gap or disjuncture strategically. So whereas the Chinese state may have a policy of non-interference, the Chinese Communist Party is able to fund political parties in Africa. There's a new governance institute which has been set up in Tanzania to train local governing or national governing parties in the region about the benefits of party-state fusion, for example. Okay? So it's very adept at creatively using this kind of shadow governance structure. That's one thing. Second thing, what constitutes non-interference? Well, shipping arms and radio jamming equipment to Robert Mugabe's regime in Zimbabwe to repress the opposition. Is that non-interference? Or is that an extreme form of interference in the internal affairs of another country? South African port workers refused to offload the arms in South Africa, and then the ship sailed up to Angola, it's thought, where they were offloaded and shipped to Zimbabwe. And then a third thing is that as China's presence has grown in Africa, in South America, in Europe, and elsewhere, that the Chinese government has kind of refined its non-interference policy to what some people refer to now as creative engagement. So it's not that China will interfere, but it will be creatively engaged. And in that book on African global infrastructures that I was mentioning a few minutes ago, there's a quote from a Chinese official where they say, the poor governance choices and development practices, I'm paraphrasing, have meant of African governments have meant we have to become involved. Okay. We're too big, our investments are too substantial just to let them off into the governance setup of other countries. We have to oversee them. And again, you can see evidence of that in things like the use of Chinese private military companies to protect the Sudanese oil pipeline. Okay, so it's not the Chinese military doing it, because that might be perceived as interference, even though China opened a military base, but I won't call it that, in 2017 in Djibouti, right? It's meant to be a restocking station for the Chinese Navy. Okay? But again, you can see this kind of web power through things like the new National Intelligence Act in China, which requires Chinese companies to share any data requested by the Chinese government. You can see it in things like the law, which requires Chinese companies overseas to grant access to ports for the Chinese, the People's Liberation Army Navy, for example. Okay, so again, these kind of subtle ways in which influence can be exercised. And in a paper with Ian Taylor back in 2010, we talked about the idea of kind of Chinese power as flexible hegemony, flexigemony, right? The idea that what you do is rather than the Western powers kind of coming and saying, you must democratize, you must have human rights, or we're not giving you aid or debt relief, right? Kind of adopting this kind of parent-child relationship with African countries, which African elites experienced as a form of humiliation and disrespect. What the Chinese approach has been to work with the grain of existing social relations in the countries they're engaging with, right? Rather than trying to go against them, that you're able to achieve a kind of deeper, more embedded, longer lasting influence through kind of accommodating to the interests of powerful stakeholders in places like Zambia or other African countries.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Is Russia being in Africa interfering in countries?
I don't think it's interfering, and I think what we're seeing now is the creation of a new kind of Eastern power axis, right, centered on Russia and China. They have somewhat different interests, but their interests also align in trying to create a new multipolar world order, where their interests are being more easily projected and received. Okay? And I think the Chinese, the way I think about this is that the Chinese approach to date has been, so people talk about the new Cold War between the West and Russia, China, and Iran and North Korea, some people include as well, right? But that the Chinese approach has been largely to work through networks, okay, financial networks, technological networks. 70% all broadband infrastructure in Africa is now Chinese built, for example. So whereas the Russian approach is to offer countries, first of all, it's to promote anti-Western propaganda, to try and turn populations against France in particular, but also the United States, and to provide what some people refer to as a regime survival package. So if you look at the countries of the Sahel, right, the Sahel is warming 1.5 times faster than the global average. Lake Chad has shrunk by 90% since the 1970s, right, with all sorts of devastating impacts on farmers, fisher folk, livelihood in the region, promoting instability, rebellion, you know, all of that. So what Russia does is offers security assistance through the Wagner Group, which has now been integrated into the Russian Army Africa Corps. And what we're seeing now is things like the emergence of the Alliance of Sahelian States in 2023. So Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, which all have military coups, kicked the French and US troops out, and has worked with the Russians. So we're seeing this new kind of emergent, I would say, territoriality in addition to the kind of networkality, I call it, of the kind of Chinese approach. But the two things reinforce each other to some extent. Now, of course, China and Russia also compete. Their economies are quite different. China has taken advantage of the Ukraine war to buy cheap oil and gas from Russia. But also a couple of months ago, it was reported that Chinese official maps have renamed cities in the Far East, like Russian Far East, like Vladivostok, with Chinese names, because that region was lost to the Russians back in the 19th century. So according to some reports, there's a lot of tension between Russia and China. It's a marriage of convenience. You know, my enemy's enemy is my friend kind of thing. But that friendship is, some people said, a marriage of convenience. Russia is a much weaker power than China economically in terms of the resources that it can bring. In particular places, the kind of security arrangements, that regime survival package is really attractive to certain political elites. But beyond that, it doesn't have that much to offer economically in terms of investment or loans or infrastructure.
Quite the perspective, right? Okay. Other questions? I had some questions that I wanted to ask, but most of them have already been asked, or you've been answering, including what I wanted to ask you in your answers. I'm still a little bit puzzled by this description of China's adaptive and relational approach. First of all, in the first moment, at first, I understood it as a pattern of China's way of China's relations with the African countries. When you were talking about this adaptive relational approach, and then I understood that you were discussing it in terms of China's relations with its own companies in Africa. So I have two different questions. One is about exactly, is there any pattern in China's relation with the African elites, also given the African agency and the fact that we have 54 countries which are clearly different from each other, so probably there is no pattern, but is there any way of relating to them which is distinctive, somehow distinctive? Because you mentioned Lina Ben Abdallah comment description as the need to capture strategies. Is this different from what other countries do? In which terms? So this is one question. And the other one is again on China's relationship with these companies there. And clearly it is a relational way of relating these companies, the way these companies relate to state and state control. But in any case, this is, it seems to me to be something very distinctive if related to other foreign companies operating in Africa. So these are roughly my questions.
Okay, thanks. Tough questions, good questions, but I've been reading a little bit about this recently. Again, other people may know more about this, but from what I've been reading in Chinese culture, there is a more collectivist kind of ethos as opposed to more the individualist ethos in the West. Okay? And that means that this kind of relationality is deeply culturally embedded. The idea of guanxi, trying to build trust, build up your social capital, we might call it, or relationships and friendships and networks, okay? Through gift giving, through an understanding of other people's perspectives and positionality. And Colin Flint talks about there being two types of power: instrumental power over somebody, okay? I'm more powerful than you, so I'm going to get you to do something. And then what he calls associative power. Right, the collective power of us working as a group. Okay, and what he says is that China, or the Chinese party state, fuses instrumental and associative power to achieve its objectives in this kind of relational format. And one of the ways in which it does that is to cultivate what some people refer to as formal inequality with informal equality with African political elites. What do I mean by that? So a few years ago, China announced the doctrine of major country diplomacy. The idea of China is a big player. The US, we're going to focus on the big guys, you know, and then there's peripheral country diplomacy. There's minor country diplomacy. There was an event a few years ago where a Chinese official was talking to an ambassador from Singapore, and he said to him, you know, China is just a big country. Singapore is a small country. That's just the reality. You know, you just don't matter. You have to accommodate to us. We're bigger and more important than you. Okay. So that's the idea of now formal inequality, as opposed to the idea of sovereign equality, which was the mantra for a long time. Okay. With, however, the idea of informal equality. So Festus Mogae, the former president of Botswana, he said, you know, the difference in dealing with the Chinese versus the Europeans and the Americans is the Euro-Americans bring a colonial mindset with them. They still look down on you, you know. I was reading the other day, Margaret Thatcher talked about how Ethiopian farmers could learn about soil types from the British. Crazy patronizing stuff. But he said the Chinese are not like that. They treat you as equals. So through building relationships, gift giving, accommodating to your interests and so on, building up those relationships and networks of trust, which are nonetheless infused with power, because obviously there's a huge power difference between China and most of the African countries it engages with. But the thing to remember as well, though, is that China is instrumentalized by African political elites. So there's a good paper by Dominic Kapinski and Ian Taylor a couple of years ago, and I forget the third author, talking about Angola and China being a marriage of convenience. And when it was no longer in the interests of the Angolan state to engage as closely with China, that was it. Okay, so there's a very instrumentalized kind of dimensions to it as well. The Chinese companies, I mean, is interesting. There are different ways of conceptualizing the relationship. Sean Breslin talks about bounded autonomy. That is, that these companies are autonomous as long as they operate within the kind of framework or structure set by the Chinese state. Or other people talk about directed improvisation. So the Chinese state kind of setting the direction of travel, but then how to implement it is up to Chinese state-owned enterprises or private companies, or notionally private companies. But I don't know if that has answered your question.
Yeah. Thank you. There anyone else wants to ask questions? So thank you very much. We all enjoyed your guest lecture, and I think now we can close the meeting here. Thank you. Yeah.